Hello, Unravelers. Welcome back to Tiff Unraveled. Listen, before we get into the case that I want to talk about today, I have to say something very clearly and very carefully. Okay, this is one of those cases where people are going to feel very differently, and they are going to feel those things very strongly. This is why it's taken me so long to get this case up. I'm not gonna lie, I was a little scared to tackle it. It involves the unalivings of three very young children. It involves allegations against their own mother. It involves self-exiting, postpartum, mental health, medication, questions, criminal responsibility, grief, forgiveness, rage, confusion, and a legal system that now has to sort through every single bit of that inside of a courtroom. Before we talk about any timeline, any evidence, any theory from either side, I want us to start where this story should always start, and that is with the victims, with the children. Their names were Cora, Dawson, and Callan. Cora was 5 years old, Dawson was 3, and Callan was 8 months old. Whatever anyone believes about the defendant in this case, Lindsay Clancy, whatever anyone believes about postpartum illness, medications, intent, planning, responsibility, punishment, forgiveness, these three children are gone. That is the center of this case. That is the loss that can never be repaired. And that is the truth that has to remain in the room with us for the entire conversation that we're about to have. I also want to ask something of everyone who is watching or listening today. This case is very painful. It's very sensitive. It's very dividing. Again, so much so that I was really, there's a heaviness on my chest even knowing what I'm about to go into. Some people are going to hear the defense's mental health arguments and they're going to feel compassion. Some people are going to hear the prosecution's evidence and feel like nothing in this world can explain or soften what happened to these children. Some people are going to feel both of those things at exactly the same time. I promise you that today I am not here to tell any one of you what to feel or how to feel. I am not here to diagnose anyone. I'm not here to excuse anyone or convict anyone from behind this microphone. I want to walk through what is publicly known, what has been reported, what prosecutors are going to argue, what defense is arguing, and what Patrick Clancy, the husband of Lindsay Clancy and the father of these three children, has said. And I just want to talk about what questions remain as we head towards trial in this case, because we are heading there. So please, if you comment with kindness, love, and respect for each other. We can disagree. I already know people will disagree about what's happened in this case. It is extremely divisive. From everything that I'm reading, everything that I'm seeing, there are a lot of different opinions on very opposite ends of what's happening here. You can disagree, and you can disagree strongly. But remember, I want this community to be built on love and respect and togetherness and just meeting of the minds. We can all talk about these things. We can all have opinions and feelings, but let's love each other through those things. And remember that behind all of our opinions, there are these children who lost their lives. There is a devastated father. There are extended families. There is a community. There is a courtroom process that is still ongoing. Lindsay Clancy, she's the subject of today's case. She is the defendant. She has pleaded not guilty, and her trial is currently scheduled to begin in July of this year. And until a jury hears that evidence and reaches a verdict, I just want to be careful in this space, again, because this is such a sensitive topic. This, however, is the case of Cora, Dawson and Callan Clancy and the criminal case against their mother, Lindsay. Everyone take a deep breath. You're going to need a few. Let's unravel. When true crime coverage talks about children, there's always like this danger in my eyes of reducing them to ages. I'm talking about big like news channels. You know, they'll say ages 5, 3, and 8 months, and then they kind of move on into the story. This is one of the things I love about YouTube and the true crime content creators on this space. I feel like we really try to bring the victims to the forefront of these cases and not just reduce them to something that, you know, we move on from quickly and then talk about the case itself. Children aren't just their names and ages is essentially what I'm trying to get at. They are whole personalities regardless of their age. They are routines. They are favorite toys, their bedtime phrases, their little habits that only the people who love them would know by heart. And after the deaths of his children, Patrick Clancy released a public statement. I read the entire thing. It's probably one of the most heartbreaking statements that I've ever read from a grieving parent, but it does give us a very clear public window into who Cora, Dawson, and Callan really were. Cora was Patrick and Lindsay's oldest child. Patrick described her as having an infectious laugh and as being, quote, stunningly beautiful, end quote. He said that she was cautious, but that her caution came from how caring she was. Cora loved babies, both real and pretend. She had baby dolls. Her favorite baby dolls were Caroline and Charlotte. And if she left that house, she would choose someone to take care of those babies. Before she was even 2 years old, Patrick said that she could wrap a baby doll in a perfect swaddle. The family would always tell Cora, like, she was such a good little mama. She wanted to grow up to be a doctor and a mom, and she would practice by giving her little brother Callan checkups. Everything that I read about this little girl just told me how gentle and how nurturing and loving she was just naturally. This is just what poured out of her soul. She loved sloths, same girl. She loved unicorns. She loved tea parties, and she loved going to lunch with Nana and Grandpa. Cora loved giving presents to people. She loved giving people gifts, and she knew everything there was to know about princesses, and her favorite princess was Sophia the First, which was also my youngest daughter's favorite princess when she was that age. Patrick said that she loved her brothers. She loved her mom and dad, and she would say that very often in her sweet little voice. He remembered, father-daughter activities with her. They used to go skiing. They used to just go visit San Francisco. They used to hang out and just talk. I have to take breaks in between each one of these. Give me 1 second. All right. Dawson. Dawson was 3 years old. Patrick described Dawson as having these big, bold, beautiful brown eyes that just, when you looked at him, they just beamed with friendship, he said. He said that Dawson was very naturally funny. He was generous, way beyond what you would ever expect from a toddler. He was always willing to share his toys. And Patrick said that for all of the love that Dawson received, he gave back even more. And that his best quality was just pure kindness. Dawson loved trucks, tractors, dinosaurs, Paw Patrol, worker guys, and being outside. Like, he was this adventurous spirit. He was very mischievous. He liked causing trouble in a way that he thought was funny. He found it hilarious. And Patrick also described Dawson as just being incredibly smart. He joked that if Lindsay didn't save up enough for retirement, it would be okay because they could just live in Dawson's guest house. He just knew that this little boy was going to grow up and become a man who was successful and smart. And every night, Dawson told his father in the same words, "Good night, Dada. I love you." And Patrick just described Dawson as his buddy, his first boy, and truly a gift. And then there was Callan. Callan was 8 months old. Patrick called Callan the easygoing one, right? He said that Callan was born with hardly any fuss at all, and he was hands down the family's best sleeper. He was happy. He was vibrant. He was always smiling. His nickname was Happy Callan. He was at 8 months old. He was sitting up on his own. He was reaching these milestones, you know? He was starting to enjoy a little bit of independence. He was reaching for whatever he could grab. Sometimes he would even join Patrick's Microsoft calls in the background. He would be like playing in the background in his jumper. And Patrick would keep his camera on during those Teams calls because he was too proud. He was a proud dad. Callan started saying Dada whenever Patrick would walk into a room. And Patrick said that his last moment with Callan was just a typical kind of part of their routine. Patrick would come up from his office at the end of the workday, and he would grab Callan and he would kind of swing him between his legs, and Callan would just laugh and smile. And Patrick said that if he was ever having a bad day, Callan just knew how to heal him, you know? These are the three human beings who were lost here. Cora, Dawson, and Callan. And they're not just kids in this headline. This isn't the Lindsay Clancy case. This is their case. This is their story. They were known, they were loved. They were the center of their father's entire life. And that is where this story has to stay grounded moving forward. And with that being said, let's move forward. Public reporting identifies Lindsay Clancy as a labor and delivery nurse at Massachusetts General Hospital. Patrick Clancy worked remotely at home for Microsoft, and they lived in Duxbury, Massachusetts, which is like this coastal town on the South Shore. They lived in a home on Summer Street. From the outside, right, there were pieces of their lives that looked familiar to a lot of young families. There was work, there was childcare, there was home, there was 3 small children, there were pediatrician appointments, there were dinner decisions, playing in the snow, there were family routines. But what this case is to me is a reminder what a family looks like from the outside is never the entire story. Never. Patrick would later go on to describe the marriage in very warm terms. He did an interview with investigators on the night of January 24th, and he told investigators that they had an amazing marriage and that they got along great. That's a quote. He said that they told each other that they loved each other like 10 times a day. They had been married for 6 years. In the public statement that Patrick wrote, the one that I just read from, describing and talking about so lovingly his children, he also said that Lindsay's mental condition rapidly worsened, but that while that was happening to her, their marriage grew stronger. He said that he took as much pride in being Lindsay's husband as he did in being a father. He said that Lindsay loved being a nurse, but that nothing in this world matched her intense love for their children and her dedication to being their mother. He wrote that being a mother was all Lindsay ever wanted. Now, again, I want to be careful here because Patrick's statement is Patrick's perspective. It matters because he was Lindsay's husband and he was the children's father. So it matters. And it matters because he knew all of them in a way that the public, that us looking from the outside in, will never know them in that way. But it doesn't answer all of our questions. It doesn't replace evidence and it doesn't erase what happened. It is one piece of the human context that surrounds a case that's now being decided through law and medicine and forensics and testimony. And that's one of the reasons why this case is so difficult. The public record contains two narratives that are almost impossible to hold together emotionally. Human beings are emotional. We're an emotional species, right? Everything comes from that. One is the picture that Patrick paints of this loving mother whose mental health was deteriorating. And then we have this other picture that the prosecution is painting, right? With these allegations that Lindsay planned and carried out the strangulation of her 3 children while her husband was out of the house. This trial is going to have to deal with both of those things. So according to, this is just public reporting that was based on statements, right? The concerns about Lindsay's mental health began escalating before January 24th, 2023. At the end of September 2022, Lindsay reportedly started feeling very anxious about returning to work after the birth of Callan. Prosecutors have said that she was initially diagnosed with generalized anxiety disorder. Her defense has described a much more serious decline, one that involved insomnia and depression, thoughts, and multiple psychiatric medications. Lindsay's defense attorney, Kevin Reddington, has said that Lindsay was prescribed 13 psychiatric medications between October and January. Reporting has listed those medications as including zolpidem, which is Ambien, right? Clonazepam, which is Klonopin, diazepam, which is Valium, fluoxetine, which is Prozac, lamotrigine, which is Lamictal, lorazepam, which is Ativan, mirtazapine, which is Remeron, quetiapine, which is Seroquel, sertraline, Zoloft, trazodone, hydroxyzine, amitriptyline, and buspirone, which is Buspar. Okay. When Patrick spoke with the investigators on January 24th, he identified Lindsay's psychiatrist as Dr. Jennifer Tufts. This is who he said prescribed the Zoloft. And then Dr. Rebecca Gelada. He listed the medications that he knew Lindsay was taking, right? Valium, trazodone, Ativan, Klonopin, Prozac, Seroquel. He told investigators that she took a bunch of medications every day, but that she took them as prescribed. I work in healthcare. That's a lot of shit to be taking together. I'm not a doctor in healthcare. That's not my That's not my role. The medication history is going to matter at trial because the defense is expected to focus very heavily on Lindsay's mental state. And what they are claiming is over medication or like inappropriate medication management. But it's also important not to jump from a lot of medications to a conclusion. Medications are very complicated. Psychiatric treatment in particular is very complicated. Side effects, very complicated. None of us should conclude that a medication list alone answers the questions as to what happened in that house. What we can say is both sides appear to agree that Lindsay was receiving mental health treatment before the deaths of her children. Where they differ, however, is on what the treatment means legally and factually. On October 25th, 2022, prosecutors say that Lindsay wrote a note on her phone about some feelings that she was having towards her children. Different reports actually quote one key word a little bit differently, so I do want to handle this carefully. Boston.com reported the note as saying, in part, quote, "I think I sort of resent my other children because they prevent me from treating Cal like my first baby." And then when I went to the Court TV article about this statement, they reported that prosecutors described the note as regret instead of resent. Either way, the rest of the publicly reported language matters also, right? Because she was writing about how she knew it wasn't fair to them, right? That she had become depressed when Cora and Dawson came home from school. This thing went on to say that, it had been a rough evening. She wanted to feel love and connection with her other kids. The prosecution points to that note as a larger part of a pattern. And the defense is going to point to that same note, I think, as evidence of distress, evidence of intrusive thoughts, or evidence of depression, or evidence of a mother who is recognizing that she's having thoughts that she doesn't want to have. And again, this is why context and caution matter when we're talking about this case. On December 20th, 2022, Lindsay was evaluated at the Women and Infants Hospital Center for Women's Behavioral Health. That is a mouthful. That was in Providence. Prosecutors later say that clinicians there determined that she did not have postpartum depression and she had no symptoms of postpartum depression. Now, Patrick is going to go on to later challenge how that was being understood publicly. According to summaries of the New Yorker interview that he did, he said that doctors were hesitant to intervene in her ongoing treatment because her prescription history made it very difficult at that time to distinguish whether the things that she was experiencing were possible medication side effects or signs of an underlying postpartum disorder. Okay. Towards the end of December, Patrick told investigators that Lindsay disclosed to him thoughts of harming the children. He clarified the timing specifically. She communicated that she was feeling this way towards the end of December, and Patrick said that at that time she reached out to her psychiatrist, Dr. Jennifer Tufts, about these thoughts and about these feelings. And then in his later interview, Patrick said the doctors told them that if she didn't have a plan, right? She wasn't going to she didn't have a plan to carry this out. And that if the thoughts were not really disturbing her in any way, they're just thoughts. They're just thoughts. That detail might be a little bit horrifying in hindsight. But again, we have to be careful here, right? Intrusive thoughts can occur in postpartum mental health conditions. A lot of people who experience this, there is a lot of women, so many women who experience these unwanted thoughts, right? And they recognize them and they're horrified by these thoughts and they never act on them. The presence of a thought doesn't automatically predict violence. But in this case, because later 3 children were taken, every single disclosure that she made, every clinical decision that was made, and every medication change, and every warning sign is now going to become a part of this investigation. And attorneys and experts and juries are going to examine them. On January 1st, 2023, Lindsay self-admitted to McLean Hospital in Belmont, Massachusetts. She was discharged 4 days later on January 5th, 2023. According to prosecutors, now, she was discharged at that time without any indication that she was a danger to herself or others. By mid-January, 2023, Patrick had reportedly asked Lindsay on multiple occasions if she was still having thoughts, and according to prosecutors, he said that she said she was not. On January 20th, now this is 4 days before the children were unalived, Court TV reported that prosecutors alleged that Lindsay searched. Oh, Google. We know Google. Okay. Lindsay searched, quote, "Can you treat a sociopath?" End quote. That search alone is one of the facts that prosecutors are highlighting as evidence that Lindsay's thinking was not simply random. It was not a psychotic break. But like everything else, it's going to have to be interpreted in court, right? What was the context behind this search? Was she searching about herself? Was she searching about someone else? Was this a search that was tied to fear or shame or intrusive thoughts or planning? The prosecution has one answer, the defense may have another. On January 22nd, the family had dinner at the home of Patrick's college friend. His name is Kyle Carney. He has been described as someone who spoke with Patrick every single day. They were very close. Carney later told investigators that Lindsay seemed fairly normal that night that they had dinner, mostly quiet. She was on her phone. She pretty much kept to herself. He said that he was actually surprised that she even came, given what Patrick had told him about her health and that he wasn't even sure if she was going to be there at all. And it was the first time that the Carneys had seen Lindsay in a couple of months. According to the search warrant affidavit, Carney told investigators that Patrick said Lindsay was just about to go back to work after having Callan and that she was having a lot of anxiety about this. Patrick said that the medications were not working, in his opinion, and Patrick went further, telling Carney that he believed that his wife was now addicted to benzodiazepines. So Patrick said that Lindsay had actually suffered withdrawals from the benzos about a month and a half earlier, and that she had, quote, "the worst side effects possible," end quote. And then she was also prescribed even more medication for sleeping. But Carney also told investigators something that adds a little bit of nuance. Patrick said that Lindsay was mostly anxious, not depressed, and that Patrick felt that the level of anxiety that Lindsay was experiencing was normal and not really severe. Okay. Patrick said that Lindsay, she had joked about talking to a therapist about her anxiety. And then he said that Patrick never really voiced a lot of concern about Lindsay being a danger to herself or others. When asked whether Lindsay had close friends in the area, Carney said that besides some local mother Facebook groups or whatever, she didn't really have a lot of friends. He said that he and his wife were planning to engage a little bit more one-on-one with Lindsay in the near future based on everything that, that they thought she was going through. Patrick had expressed that he felt like he needed to get more involved because he thought that Lindsay had been going to a psychiatrist by herself for a while and that she, at this point, had been prescribed way too many medications. On January 23rd, prosecutors said that Lindsay wrote she had, quote, a touch of postpartum anxiety, end quote, about returning to work. And then came January 24th. Here is where I need everyone to get out their notebooks. Pen, paper, jot it down if you have to, but we're going to go through it. All right. This is all according to the public timeline that's been presented through law enforcement and the prosecutors of this case, okay? And according to those things, January 24th began in a way that really didn't look like the beginning of what this case has become. That morning, Lindsay took Cora to a pediatrician appointment. After they came home, Lindsay played outside in the snow with Cora and Dawson. She had sent pictures of herself and the children to her mother and to Patrick. Bright, sunny, snowy, happy day, right? That image, these babies playing in the snow, these pictures that were sent to these family members. This is one of the things to me that makes this case so haunting because Cora and Dawson would not be alive anymore and Callan would be critically injured. At 4:02 p.m., prosecutors say that Lindsay searched Kids Miralax on her cell phone, and then she searched Takeout 3V. 3V is a restaurant in Plymouth, Massachusetts. So after that, prosecutors say that she used Apple Maps to determine how long it was going to take to drive from the family's home in Duxbury to the restaurant 3V. At 4:47 p.m., Lindsay reportedly called a CVS in Kingston and asked, "Do you have children's Miralax?" Right? The manager on the phone had said that they don't have any, but they had similar things for children. The search warrant affidavit adds a key detail here. The CVS manager, her name is Angela Kraus. She told the investigators that the female had called the store asking about the children's laxative right before Patrick had arrived to the store. And so, in the eyes of prosecution, this confirms that it was Lindsay who had made that call. 4:53 p.m. Are you guys writing this down? This is the timeline. Lindsay texted Patrick. Patrick was working from his home office in the basement, and the text, according to prosecutors, said, "Any chance you want to do takeout from 3V? I didn't cook anything. It's been a long day." At 5:10 p.m., Lindsay called 3V and ordered takeout. Shortly after that, Patrick left the house. He left the house on Lindsay's direction to pick up the medicine that she needed from CVS and then the food from 3V. This is one of the most important parts of the prosecution's theory. Okay, the search warrant affidavit says it very clearly. It says, quote, "It is the belief of investigators that Lindsay Clancy called both CVS and 3V restaurant in order to facilitate Mr. Clancy leaving the house for an extended period of time so that she could commit these crimes and attempt." Prosecutors are arguing here that what Lindsay did was create this window of time, right? that she researched the travel time, that she sent Patrick on these errands, and that she used that time that he was going to be gone to be alone with her children. The 3V receipt, right? The investigators got the receipt from the restaurant, 3V, and it shows that the order for the 2 items were placed at 5:10 p.m. and that Patrick paid for those items at 5:55 p.m. Using Apple Maps, investigators calculated all of these drive times, right? So it was roughly 3 minutes from the house to CVS Pharmacy, and then 8 minutes from CVS Pharmacy to the restaurant, 3V, and then 9 minutes from the restaurant, 3V, back to the house. The defense, on the other hand, right, is arguing that what happened here was not some calculated murder. This was just some catastrophic psychiatric breakdown event. At 5:32 p.m., Patrick arrived to that Kingston CVS. And at 5:33 p.m., Patrick called Lindsay. She didn't answer when he called at 5:33, but 1 minute later, she called him back. And she confirmed, yes, I need you to get a children's laxative. Like, she was just confirming to him what he was sent there to get. Patrick later told investigators that when they spoke, she seemed like she was in the middle of something. 5:54 p.m., Patrick got to 3V restaurant. He paid for the order and he left. At 6:09 p.m., Patrick returned home. When he got there, the house was silent. He called out for Lindsay, but she didn't answer. He went upstairs to their bedroom. The door was locked. He, at some point, was able to unlock the door and get into the bedroom. And inside of the bedroom, he saw blood on the floor, and he saw that the bedroom window was open. He ran outside, and he found Lindsay on the ground, very badly injured. She had apparently jumped out of the bedroom window, which was a second-story window. Patrick, of course, calls 911. 6:11 p.m., Duxbury police dispatched all cruisers to 47 Summer Street for an attempted involving a woman who had apparently cut herself and then jumped from a second-story window. Officers arrive and they find Lindsay outside. She was breathing. She was semi-conscious. The cuts on her body were not even bleeding any longer. And Patrick was there with her. Officer Stephen Hall, right? This is one of the very first officers on the scene. He describes Lindsay as laying on her back with her head toward the house, lacerations to her wrist and her neck. Officer Brian Josephine noticed 2 vehicles in the driveway, right? A 2020 white Chevy Silverado and a 2019 Kia Sorento. Officers gained entry to the house from a rear sliding door that was already open. And then Patrick goes inside to look for his kids. It was at that time that officers heard his screaming from inside the house. When they got to the basement, Patrick was reportedly yelling, "She killed the kids." All of this is documented in the search warrant affidavit. The officer's observations are devastating. Officer Josephine, right, he described going into a rear room, and this is where he found Dawson. Dawson was on his back. He was unresponsive, and he was blue and purple in his face and had bruising on his neck. And beside him, there was a blue resistance band, like one of those bands that you use to like work out. Officer Vincent Cahill had gone to the left side of the basement, and that's where he found Cora And when he found Cora, she had blood on her hand and on her face and on her, or coming from her nose. And then he turned around and realized that 8-month-old Callan was on the ground behind him, completely unresponsive. He observed what he described as indents and trauma to the infant's neck with a blue exercise resistance band on the ground next to Callan, and Officer Hall described the first child he saw in the back room as having no shirt on, with his face and his chest blue. Cora and Callan were found on the floor in a den area of the basement. Dawson was found alone on the floor of Patrick's office, and all 3 children were found with those workout bands around or near their necks. So, Lindsay at this time was taken to South Shore Hospital in Weymouth, definitely. And she had suffered severe injuries. She was later transferred to Brigham and Women's Hospital in Boston, Massachusetts, and the search warrant affidavit documents the full extent of this woman's injuries in clinical detail. So when Trooper Jerome McDonald executed the search warrant for trace evidence at Brigham and Women's on January 25th, he observed on Lindsay multiple lacerations from a sharp object on both wrists, possible scrapes on the backs of both hands around the knuckles, 2 bruises on the left bicep, multiple lacerations to the left and right side of the neck with a deep cut on the right side, and possible light bruising to both thighs. He was unable to observe any trauma to her back because of her spinal cord injury at the time. So the nurse, her nurse's name at the time was Rochelle Amity, and she said she didn't witness any trauma to Lindsay's back at that time either. So this is a lot. I'm going to take a second. BRB. You won't even notice that I'm gone. Watch this. So the hospital's nursing progress notes obviously documents some very specific injuries. C1, burst fracture. So when we talk about C1, we're talking about cervical spine. Okay. That's the kind of the spine between the neck and like if I had to give it to you guys, it's like between the neck and the shoulder blades. And then you have thoracic spine, which they call the T-spine. So that's kind of between the shoulder blades and like the mid lower back. And then we have the lumbar spine. So if you hear C1, T1, L1, like that's what we're splitting the spine up into, like 3 things. The more you know. Okay. Anyway, so we had some C1 injuries, some C4 injuries. Then we have T5 and 6 injuries, right? So mid back. And then we have some hemorrhaging into the retroperitoneum. I'm using big words. I'm sorry. Rib fractures, superficial lacerations to the anterior neck, and thyroid edema, which means swelling of the thyroid. That's like right here. Okay, look, long story short, she had cuts to both wrists, lacerations to her neck, some broken ribs, broken bones in her back, and spinal cord injuries. Okay. Her attorney later said that those injuries left her permanently paralyzed from the waist down. And that is true. That's what we know to be true. So the warrant also notes that on January 25th, this is the next day, around 3:30 a.m., Lindsay became unresponsive at the hospital. She was worked on by staff at that time and then was considered to be stable again around 4:30 a.m. The children were taken to Beth Israel Deaconess Hospital in Plymouth. Callan, the baby, he was med-flighted to Boston Children's Hospital. At the hospital, obviously, we have emergency department doctors, working on on these kids, documenting what they're observing. Dr. Michael Snyder, this is the doctor who treated Cora. He said that Cora was in cardiac arrest upon her arrival. He observed ecchymosis. Ecchymosis is bruising, basically, and popped blood vessels around her head, eyes, and neck. He also noted some bruising on her chest, which he said most likely came from when they tried to perform CPR to revive Cora. He said Cora was wearing gray and orange pajamas, and at that time they had been partially cut off, again in an attempt to save her life. Trooper Ashley, I'm so sorry, I don't know how to say your name. Ashley Fayea, she's with the State Police Crime Services. She noticed a bruise on the inside of Cora's right bicep, and Dr. Snyder pronounced Cora dead at 7:28 p.m. on January 24th. Now, Dr. Mark Tenerowicz, I'm really sorry if that's wrong. Also, this is the doctor who treated Dawson. We're going to call him Dr. Mark. Said that Dawson was also in cardiac arrest on arrival to the hospital. Dr. Mark observed signs of strangulation, specifically petechiae. So that's like little red, Google it. You'll see you'll see what petechiae is. It's kind of like little red speckling on the side of Dawson's face. He also noticed a bruise on Dawson's right knee and described what he thought was like an old bruise on Dawson's right shin. Dawson was beneath a white blanket and a green hospital like Johnny across his midsection. He had AED pads on his chest. That's a defibrillator across his chest and across his back. And he had multiple medical tubes coming from his mouth when Dr. Mark got to him, and he pronounced Dawson dead at approximately 7:28 p.m., the same time as Cora. Dr. Benjamin Kaufman, this is who initially treated Callan, noted no specific injuries beyond the cardiac arrest and the critical condition before the baby was med-flighted to Boston. So at that 7:28 time frame, when Cora and Dawson were both being pronounced unalived, Callan was still alive. Fuck. Callan fought for 3 days, and on January 27th, 2023, Callan died at Boston Children's Hospital. The Plymouth County District Attorney's Office later said that the Office of the Chief Medical Examiner determined Cora and Dawson's cause of death was asphyxia. Callan's cause of death was complications of asphyxia. So the search warrant does actually provide autopsy details. Dr. Barbara Vidal, she is the one who conducted the autopsies of Cora and Dawson on January 25th, and her observations for both of these children included, I'm going to read just so I don't miss anything. Small bruising on both sides of both legs. Small bruising on the back of the right leg, which was not present on Cora. Small bruising on the right arm. Ligature marks around the neck. Redness of the head. Petechiae in the face, inside the eyelids, and inside the upper and lower lip, and heavy lungs. Skeleton x-rays were negative for trauma. There was no evidence of blunt force trauma, brain bleeds, or skull fractures. There was no soft tissue damage in the back. The neck muscles were negative for hemorrhaging. The hyoid bone was intact. The eyes did show hemorrhaging and involvement of the optic nerve. Dr. Vidal later determined that the cause of death for both Cora and Dawson was asphyxiation. Callan's autopsy, this was done separately, was conducted by Dr. Kimberly Springer on January 29th at the medical examiner's office in Boston. Callan was observed during the autopsy in a diaper and a gray and white blanket with medical devices and tubes attached to his mouth, nose, and legs. Dr. Springer noted abrasions to both sides of Callan's neck and petechia, in her words, all over his face. She stated that she did not find any hemorrhage in Callan's neck during the autopsy. She collected his eyes and his brain for further analysis and later determined Callan's cause of death to be complications from asphyxiation. I hate cases like these, but they're important. These kids are important. We keep going. Let's keep going. If you're still here, you already know. I love you. Thank you. The autopsy findings, right? We have the petechiae, we have the ligature marks, we have the heavy lungs, we have the hemorrhaging of the eyes. All of these things, as the medical examiners have said, they know what they're doing, right? Are consistent with death by strangulation. The absence of blunt force trauma, skull fractures, or neck muscle hemorrhaging tell their own story about the mechanism of death, right? And then we have the intact hyoid bone, right? Which is very often cited in strangulation cases involving adults. It's less significant in children because the hyoid bone doesn't fully ossify until later in life. But these are all details that are going to be examined very closely by multiple medical experts at trial. So that is the day. That's the day as it's publicly laid out through what we know so far, which is just reporting, okay, on the police and the prosecutors' accounts. So here's the courtroom battle, okay? The prosecution's theory is Lindsay Clancy planned the unalivings of her children, and she created the opportunity to carry them out. Prosecutors point to the searches, right? And the use of Apple Maps before Patrick left the house. They point to Lindsay asking Patrick to pick up the medication and the takeout. They point to the timing, right? Patrick leaving, the children being attacked while he was gone, and then Lindsay returning his call during that window. That's what they're saying happened. They point to the notes in the phone, the alleged searches. They point to the physical evidence and the medical examiner's findings, and they're pointing to the fact that all three of the children were found with the workout bands around or near their necks. At an earlier proceeding, prosecutor Jennifer Sprague said, quote, "The defendant is a danger to herself and others. She planned these murders, gave herself the time and privacy needed to commit the murders, and then she strangled each child in the place where they should have felt the safest, at home with their mom." Court TV also reported Sprague saying, quote, "The defendant did not take advantage of the situation. She created the situation." So that is the prosecution's frame as we're moving into trial. They're saying this is not some sudden, unknowable break, um, but it's planning. It's not some accident. It's not some involuntary event. It is a deliberate sequence of choices made by Lindsay Clancy. And if prosecutors can prove beyond a reasonable doubt not only that Lindsay Clancy caused the deaths of her children, but that she had the required criminal intent behind them, and she is criminally responsible, that theory can lead to conviction, obviously. this case is not just about whether Lindsay's actions caused the deaths, right? There's no denying that. The defense is not denying that what she did caused the deaths of her children. The defense is seeking a split trial, right? Reportedly offering to stipulate her involvement in the underlying conduct if the case was bifurcated, split up. The fight is expected to heavily center on her state of mind when these unalivings occurred, which leads us into defense's theory, right? The defense's theory is radically different. Lindsay's attorney, Kevin Reddington, he has described Lindsay as a devoted mother whose mental health drastically deteriorated after the birth of her youngest son, Callan. He has pointed to postpartum mental illness, thoughts, lack of sleep, psychiatric treatment, and a rapid series of over-medication. The defense has suggested, like I said, that she was over-medicated or completely improperly treated, and that she's not criminally responsible for her actions because of her mental state at the time. I should have said this at the beginning. I shouldn't wait this far to get. I'm not a lawyer. I'm not a criminal anything. I'm not a forensic expert in anything. I'm not a psychiatrist. I'm not a psychologist. I am none of those things. This is just things that I have gathered. I'm a little true crime sponge, and I soak it all up. I read it all, and I try to get what I can from it. This is literally just me talking to my girlies and guys about what's happening, right? Nothing more than that. But from what I understand, the defense is basically arguing that because of mental disease or because of some mental defect, Lindsay lacked the substantial capacity to either appreciate the wrongfulness of her conduct or to conform her conduct to the law, right? I'm not saying anything legally concise here. I'm not giving legal advice. Exact jury instructions are going to matter here as far as like what the judge is telling the jury to find this woman guilty or not guilty of. But that's like the broadness of it. I don't think that they are saying she didn't do this. I think that they're saying, what was her mental state? What was she thinking when this happened? Is she guilty based on that? Again, defense is pointing to the entire timeline of medications. There was a lot. There really was a lot. There were 13 medications between October and January. There was reported insomnia. There was anxiety. There was depression. There was ideation. There was a lot of ongoing treatment. And then, according to Lindsay's own later statements, right? Apparently, according to her, okay, this is just according to her, I don't know. There was a male voice telling her that this was the last chance that she had to take the lives of her children and take the life of herself. Do we believe her? It really comes down to that. She's not describing a circumstance where she didn't do this. That's not what's being said. That's not what's being argued. Do we believe her? Do we? Guys, please someone talk to me about this. I have my own opinions about this case. I'm trying not to let them influence how I'm telling it. I am more than interested in how you guys are feeling right now. Boston.com reported that on February 6th, 2023, while sitting with psychologist Dr. Paul Zeisel, this is a psychologist who had been hired by the defense team, Lindsay called her husband Patrick and told him that she had heard voices and had a, quote, moment of psychosis after he left the house. She told him that a man's voice had told her to unalive the kids and unalive herself because it was her last chance. Patrick later told police that Lindsay had never told him before that moment that she had heard voices, and that she had never before ever said the word psychosis to him. Now, I feel like that fact alone can be cut into very different directions. Don't you think? Like, prosecutors, I feel like, can argue that it suggests that the voices claim emerged later, right? After she realized what she had gotten herself into. And that claim should be viewed very skeptically, with a grain of salt, if you will. And then, of course, the defense is going to say that people that are in psychosis, right, or these severe psychiatric crises don't always understand what's happening to them in real time, right? It's only hindsight 2020 type thing, right? The defense also disputes the prosecution's interpretation of the suicide attempt. So Reddington, Lindsay's attorney, is arguing that Lindsay had no reason to unalive her children, and that the entire question that everyone is asking, right, why, points to mental illness. That's it. He says she's a troubled soul. And he argues that, look at her injuries. They're severe, they're permanent, and they're consistent with an actual real attempt to end her own life. That was her intent. Defense has also tried to shape the trial structure around Lindsay's state of mind, right? Court TV reported that Mr. Reddington, as I touched on a moment ago, he sought to split this trial into two completely different phases. Okay. One, addressing whether Lindsay committed the acts, and another addressing her mental state and criminal responsibility. The judge in this case, his name is Judge William Sullivan. He denied an earlier request. He was saying that basically it would be nearly impossible to separate the evidence, and that doing so in this case would be duplicative. So at the beginning of this year, the defense renewed the request and said that Lindsay Clancy was willing to formally stipulate in writing her involvement in the conduct that resulted in the deaths of her children, arguing that the only live issue should be lack of criminal responsibility. And of course, prosecutors are opposing splitting the trial. And so I feel like that tells us a lot about what this trial might actually become. Because, again, the defense is not simply saying she didn't do it. That's not what's happening here. That's not what they're saying. The defense is expected to say that the central question to this trial is, what was her mind capable of understanding and intending when she did this terrible thing? What do you guys think? Talk to me. Please talk to me. So one of the most unusual, I guess, and emotionally complicated aspects of this entire case is Patrick and his public position on this whole thing. Patrick was the person who came home. Patrick was the person who found Lindsay injured outside. Patrick was the person who asked where his children were. Patrick was the one who ran into that house. Patrick was the one who found Cora and Dawson and Callan in that basement. Patrick is the one who removed the bands from their necks and tried to save them. Patrick is the one who has had to face this impossible question of what to do when all three of your children need you at one time. Can you imagine being Patrick? He did an interview with the New Yorker. We talked about it. And Patrick actually asked the question. He said, quote, "What do you do when you have 3 kids like that? How do you pick?" End quote. And yet, just days after the deaths of his children, Patrick released this statement asking people to forgive Lindsay as he had done. He wrote in that statement that Lindsay was loving and caring towards him, towards his children, their family, their friends, her patients. He said that all he wished for her was that she could somehow find peace. In October of 2024, Patrick spoke extensively to the New Yorker. He said, "I wasn't married to a monster. I was married to someone who got sick." He described his concerns about Lindsay's prescriptions and her access to care. He said that he called more than a dozen therapists and he couldn't find anyone with immediate availability. He described sitting in on virtual calls, psychiatric visits, feeling like the approach was essentially, what are your symptoms? Take these pills. That's how Patrick describes it. He also talks about that day. He talks about January 24th. And Patrick said that a few weeks earlier, he would have been reluctant to leave Lindsay alone with the children. But that day seemed like a really good one. A really good day. He said if he could go back, he would have called McLean and said, quote, "Take her away, lock the door, keep her in there for a year if you have to." End quote. Patrick also described his later conversations with Lindsay. He said that he asked her whether she planned it and whether that was why she had sent him out that night. And according to Patrick, she said no, that it was like the snap of fingers. He said that he asked whether she had searched for ways to unalive, as prosecutors are alleging, and that she said yes, but it was for herself because she had been for 2 months at that point. Again, these are Patrick's statements about what Lindsay had told him. They're not the same thing as findings of fact. They matter, though, because maybe they reflect what Lindsay has said privately to Patrick, but I don't feel like they're going to replace courtroom evidence. And that's just kind of where I sit right now. It's a hard place to sit. I'm sitting there. It's uncomfortable. My ass hurts. That's where I sit. So Patrick later sold the Duxbury house. He has since moved to Manhattan. He ran the Boston Marathon in memory of his children, and he raised money for the Boston Children's Hospital where Callan was treated. In January of 2026, Court TV reported that Patrick filed a wrongful death lawsuit against Lindsay's mental health providers and their practices. He was alleging in these lawsuits that their treatment failures led to the deaths of his children. That lawsuit alleges that Lindsay was misdiagnosed, over-medicated, and that there were warning signs there way before this happened that were either missed or completely mishandled. It names the providers and the practices, and it describes the medication changes, the ideations, the feelings of being disconnected from her body, and alleged failures to respond to those things appropriately. According to Court TV's reporting on this lawsuit in particular, Lindsay's visits with her psychiatrist in January of 2023 were all virtual. They lasted approximately 17 minutes each. That detail, I suppose, can be quite striking because it's just a huge question of whether Lindsay's providers adequately assessed her. And that whole thing is very central, I think, to both the civil case and this broader public conversation about postpartum mental health care. Those are the civil allegations. They are not proven facts unless and until they are established through that legal process. But that lawsuit does show what Patrick's view of this entire tragedy is. And that is that his view is not simply that Lindsay alone made this isolated choice. His public position is that Lindsay was severely ill and that the medical system completely failed him and his family. Now, other people, some of you, some of me, are going to see this case entirely differently. And I don't think that this criminal trial is going to be a referendum on Patrick's forgiveness. I think we know where he stands as far as that is concerned. What this trial is, it's about the evidence. It's about the criminal responsibility. It's about the law. And I know that that doesn't make this any easier for some of you, for some of us, for some of we, see why this it's hard. I don't know where you stand. I want to hear. I want to know. Because based on that, it's going to make this criminal trial look a lot differently for a lot of us, I think. Does that make sense? I'm tired. Anyway, all right, moving on. Because this case involves claims of postpartum mental illness and possible postpartum psychosis, I just want to talk about it. This is the dichotomy of this case and why it makes it so hard. This is why there are people on both ends of this case. I want to do it very carefully. I am not diagnosing Lindsay Clancy with anything. I have no idea whether she did or did not have postpartum psychosis. I am waiting to see and hear the evidence that comes out in trial. I do have my own opinions. I won't go into them right now. I'd love to hear y'all's, though. I really would. I'm not saying that postpartum psychosis explains anything in this case. And I'm not saying that even people who have postpartum psychosis, which I think there's a difference between psychosis and depression, postpartum depression, postpartum psychosis. I think they're two different things. I'm not saying that either one would indicate or justify violence in any way. In fact, I feel like this is one of the most important points in this case. So, all right, here's what I got for you. Okay. Postpartum Support International describes postpartum or perinatal psychosis as a serious perinatal mental health disorder. PSI says that it usually begins in the first 2 weeks after birth, but can occur within a year postpartum. PSI estimates that it happens in about 1 to 2 out of every 1,000 deliveries. PSI also describes postpartum psychosis as temporary and treatable with professional help, but also as an emergency. Their guidance says that immediate help is essential and is very important to stay with the parent and child to ensure everyone's safety. Symptoms can include delusions or strange beliefs, hallucinations, agitation, hyperactivity, severe depression or lack of emotion, decreased need for sleep or inability to sleep, rapid mood swings, and difficulty communicating. PSI also says something that needs to be emphasized. The majority of people who experience postpartum psychosis do not harm themselves or anyone else. But because psychosis can involve delusional thinking and impaired judgment, there can be a risk of that, and it has to be treated as an emergency. The distinction matters. We should be able to talk about postpartum psychosis as very real, very serious, and very urgent without stigmatizing every mother who struggles after the birth of a child. We should be able to talk about mental illness without it turning into a blanket excuse for violence. That's not why I'm not with that. We should be able to hold two truths. One, mental illness can be devastating and can also be medically real. And also that Cora and Dawson and Callan died violent deaths. That tension, to me, those two truths and holding those two truths at the same time is why this case is so hard. For the prosecution, the evidence is pointing to planning and criminal responsibility. And for the defense, the evidence is pointing to a mother who is in a psychiatric emergency who should not be held legally responsible in the way that prosecution is alleging. For the public, those two frames very often become a shouting match. But in court, they will have to become questions for the experts. They will have to be shown through documents, through timelines, and explained to the jurors. Lindsay Clancy was initially charged after the deaths, and in September of 2023, a Plymouth County grand jury indicted her on 3 counts of murder and 3 counts of strangulation. Lindsay Clancy has pled not guilty. Her case has taken a lot of time, and in part, that's due to the amount of discovery and the complexity of all of this mental health evidence. NBC Boston had reported that the trial had been postponed more than once, and that in November of 2025, the judge moved the trial to what we now are expecting July 20th, 2026. The judge also denied the defense's motion to move the trial to Boston, and so the case is expected to remain in Plymouth County. The court has also had to deal with a lot of the logistics around Lindsay's medical condition. She remains confined to a wheelchair, and the court has, of course, discussed security and transportation and all of these medical issues as far as the trial is concerned. Another major legal issue has been, like we talked about, the defense's request to bifurcate or split the trial. The defense wants one phase to focus on whether Lindsay committed the acts, and another, which they're not denying she did, I don't think, and another to focus on her mental state and whether she was criminally responsible for those acts. Judge William Sullivan has denied that request, again, saying that it would be nearly impossible to separate that evidence in this trial. So, as I said earlier, defense did renew the request. They offered to stipulate in writing that Lindsay was involved in the conduct that caused the deaths of her children, arguing that the real trial issue should be the state of mind. And of course, prosecutors are opposing that approach. We said that already. As far as the most recent public reporting that I could find, the trial is scheduled for July 20th of 2026. There's a final pre-trial hearing scheduled for July 13th. And that means that obviously I'm making this episode before a jury has heard this case. And so, of course, we know that before going into trial, we're just chatting, right? Because we never really know. I mean, there may be evidence presented at trial that has not yet been made public. We never really know everything until it goes to trial. This is why I love trials so much. And that's where we get everything. That's where we get all of the things. There may be expert testimony that changes how people understand this timeline that we walk through. There might be rulings still to come about what the jury can and cannot hear. So anything that we talk about now has to be said with that limitation in mind, of course. And let's talk about some questions that the jury is going to have to answer. When people talk about this case online, right? Everything that I've read, the debate often becomes moral very quickly. How could a mother do this? Was she evil? Was she sick? Was she failed? Was it planned? Was it psychosis? Is forgiveness appropriate? Is punishment enough? Is treatment enough? There are so many questions. These are human questions They're questions that I expect all of you to have. A jury, however, is going to be asked legal questions. Did Lindsay Clancy cause the deaths of her children, Cora, Dawson, and Callan? Based on the defense's willingness to stipulate involvement if the trial were split, it appears that the defense may not focus on denying the physical conduct, but again, the exact trial strategy remains to be seen. We're not there yet. Did Lindsay Clancy act with the required criminal intent for murder under Massachusetts law? Was she criminally responsible at the time? What does the evidence show about planning, which the prosecution is heavy on? This was planned. As far as we know, and there may be more, even just right now, publicly, we know about the Apple Maps search, the takeout request, the call to CVS, the timing, the alleged searches about sociopathy, the notes that she took on her phone, the phone call during the window when Patrick was gone. What's the evidence going to show about her mental state? I'm sure that they are going to talk about the months of anxiety leading up to this tragic event. I'm sure they're gonna talk about the medication history, the insomnia, the ideation, the thoughts about harming the children, the admission and discharge to McLean, the alleged command hallucination that she had when she called her husband after all of this was said and done, the self-harm, the jump from the second-story window. All of that's going to be talked about. What is it going to show a jury? And what should the jurors make of Patrick's account of all of this, right? He knew Lindsay intimately. He's the one who found the children, and he forgave her publicly. He later spoke about systemic medical failures. He even filed a civil lawsuit against her providers. But he is also a grieving father. He's not the judge and he's not the jury. So what should jurors make of the medical providers' records and their decisions regarding Lindsay's care? What did they know? What were they told? What did they document? What did they prescribe? What warnings were they given or not given? What symptoms did they recognize? What symptoms, if any, did they miss? And perhaps the hardest question of all, if a person's mental state is severely impaired, where does the law, in a case like this, draw the line between an explanation and responsibility? It's not a question that we can answer from the outside. We can have opinions. We can talk about them, remember, respectfully and with love and kindness. But it is the question that this trial is moving towards. At the very beginning of this episode, I said that we were going to keep the children at the center. I meant that, and that's where I want to end this episode. Cora Clancy. She was 5 years old. She loved babies and baby dolls. She loved princesses, Sophia the First, tea parties, sloths, unicorns, and she loved giving gifts. She wanted to be a doctor and she wanted to be a mama. Dawson Clancy was 3 years old. He loved trucks. He loved tractors. He loved dinosaurs. He loved Paw Patrols. He loved what he called worker guys. And he loved being outside. He was funny. He was generous. He was mischievous in the best ways. And most of all, he was kind. Callan Clancy, he was only 8 months old, and I know a lot of people are just like, what can you be at 8 months old? You can be so much. You are so much, even at 8 months old. Callan was happy Callan. He was always smiling. He was easygoing. He loved to say dada anytime Patrick walked into a room. He loved being in the background of his dad's Teams calls, and he loved laughing when his father would swing him between his legs after a long work day, and he healed the souls of the people around him. They should be growing up right now. no matter what you think about this case and about Lindsay, I think we can agree on that. They should be growing up right now. Cora should be older. Dawson should be older. Callan should be running around and getting into absolutely everything. That's what they should be doing. Their father should be hearing their voices in his home, not describing them in memorial statements, in interviews. That's the loss. As Lindsay Clancy's trial approaches, there's probably going to be way more coverage. There will probably be a lot more arguments. There's going to be probably expert testimony that gives us, more context, maybe some more understanding on either side. There may be evidence that confirms what one side has argued or complicates what we thought we knew. And again, my goal here is not to take sides. My goal here was just to lay out the known public record very carefully with compassion for the victims, respect for our legal process, and of course, the awareness that this case touches issues that are deeply personal for so many people. I want to end it by saying this. If you are a parent who has struggled postpartum, please hear this clearly. Needing help does not make you a bad parent. Intrusive thoughts can be terrifying. They can be scary. I promise you, help is available. If you or anyone that you know or love is experiencing postpartum depression, postpartum psychosis, or any mental health crisis, I need you to treat that as urgent. In the United States, you can call or text 988 for support 24/7. The National Maternal Mental Health Hotline is 833-852-6262. Postpartum Support International also has resources and a helpline. And listen, if you're here as a part of this community, thank you. This one is very heavy. It's heavy for a lot of reasons. It's heavy for a lot of people. Thank you for being here with me to listen to me yap about it. It means more than you know. Again, I know that people are going to want to talk about it. If you're going to leave a comment, please be kind. Disagree. If you disagree, that's fine. Ask hard questions. Talk about the evidence. Talk about what we know, but do it with respect for each other. Absolutely do it with respect for the children, the victims in this case, and for the fact that none of us are immune from tragedy touching our lives in ways that we never expected. So keep that in mind. Cora, Dawson, and Callan mattered. They still matter. And until this trial begins, that's where we'll leave this case, with 3 children lost, a mother awaiting trial, and a father who is living with something absolutely unimaginable in a courtroom, preparing to decide what the evidence is going to prove. I will see you guys soon. And until I do, you know what to do. Please stay safe. Keep asking questions and keep unraveling. Love you.